Tonight, we uncover the story of a king who searched for more than glory. Gilgamesh, ruler of Uruk, carved his name into stone and myth, but what they never told you is what he found. A blueprint buried in clay, a forbidden truth older than the Bible, hidden beneath fireproof libraries and sealed behind priestly edits. This was not just an epic, it was a smuggled message across time, a code about death, memory, and the kind of knowledge empires were built to erase. The gods did not give him immortality, they gave him a story. And that story, once decoded, could shatter timelines, reveal lost teachers, and unmask the real reason history repeats. For centuries, they buried it, censored it, renamed it. But the tablets never burned, and now they are speaking again. So before we break the seal, before we read what was never meant to be read, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. What follows is not just a legend, it is the instruction manual they tried to destroy. There was a time before history remembered itself, before the world had books, and before kingdoms had names. In that silence, beneath the dust of forgotten rivers, something waited. It was not gold, not treasure, but a voice, pressed into clay, waiting for the right hands to find it again. When archaeologists brushed away the soil of ancient Mesopotamia in the 1800s, they uncovered a sound that had not been heard for more than 4,000 years, the story of a king who refused to die. His name was Gilgamesh. The moment his words were read, the past changed forever. Imagine a world where cities rose beside the Tigris and Euphrates, where priests watched the stars and wrote messages for the gods, and where the first libraries stood not of paper but of clay tablets stacked like bricks of memory. Yet, for centuries, that world vanished from the human timeline. We called it myth, a fable, until the day the earth itself spoke. Those tablets told of Uruk, a city older than the pyramids, ruled by a man 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. A king so powerful, even death trembled when he dreamed. But what made Gilgamesh's story dangerous was not his strength, it was his question. What if immortality is not for the gods alone? It is said the gods punished him for asking, but perhaps it was not punishment. Perhaps it was fear. To seek what only the heavens are meant to know is to challenge the very system that keeps mankind obedient. And when Gilgamesh went searching for forbidden knowledge, he did what no mortal had dared. He stepped beyond the permission of the divine. Thousands of years later, when the first fragments of his epic were pieced together, the world realized that long before any holy book, long before Moses, Abraham, or Christ, there was already a story about creation, the flood, the fall of man, and the longing for eternal life. These clay tablets were older than Genesis, older than the Bible itself, and that discovery changed everything. Suddenly, the foundation of what we thought was original truth began to shake. Who copied whom? What was borrowed? What was hidden? The Epic of Gilgamesh became a mirror no religion wanted to look into. Because if this story came first, then the wisdom we call divine might not belong to the gods at all, but to men who dared to remember. The silence before history was not empty, it was guarded. For centuries, empires rose upon buried ruins. Temples were built on top of older temples, and the name Gilgamesh was quietly erased. Why? Because his legend contained a blueprint, one that taught how to rise, how to question, and how to seek the truth even against the will of heaven. And the greatest secret of all, hidden beneath every broken tablet, was that knowledge, once found, can never truly be destroyed. When we listen to the clay speak, we are not reading a myth. We are remembering who we were before forgetting became a law. In the city of Uruk, sunlight fell across towers of white stone and bronze gates that gleamed like mirrors. Merchants filled the markets, Priests offered incense to gods carved from gold, and the people whispered one name with both pride and fear: Gilgamesh, the king who had no equal, no rival, and no limit. He had built walls that touched the clouds and temples that reached for the stars. But within him lived a hunger no kingdom could satisfy. He had conquered everything except time, and that was the one enemy he could never forgive. Legends say he was 2/3 divine, but that last part, the human part, was a curse. He could feel the years closing in like a shadow at his heels. Each victory, each festival, each sunrise reminded him that even a king would one day turn to dust. To the people, he seemed invincible, but in the silent hours before dawn, Gilgamesh stared beyond the horizon and wondered why gods should live forever while men fade. That question was forbidden. To ask it was to break the sacred balance between heaven and earth. But Gilgamesh had already begun to see the cracks. He ruled not just with strength, but with curiosity, a trait that frightened even his priests. The temple chants spoke of obedience. The old laws warned that seeking the secrets of the gods would bring ruin. Yet he could not stop himself. The thought of death became an infection in his mind. He began searching the libraries of Uruk, reading tablets older than his ancestors, and found whispers of a power lost before the first city was built. The gods, it said, once walked among men and shared the gift of endless life. But when men grew arrogant, the heavens withdrew that knowledge and sealed it beyond reach. Gilgamesh swore he would find it again. Some say it was pride, others say it was destiny. For a man born partly divine, to live like the rest of mortals was unbearable. The priests warned him that to chase immortality was to challenge the order of creation itself. But Gilgamesh did not believe in orders made by fear. He believed in what could be learned, what could be found, what could be earned, and somewhere deep within him he sensed that the gods had not destroyed the secret. They had only hidden it. So he turned away from the comfort of his throne and began to look beyond the world he ruled. He studied the stars. He walked among the old ruins of Sumer and listened to the wind moving through broken temples. He began to see death not as an end, but as a door. And doors, he thought, were meant to be opened. In that moment, the king of Uruk became more than a ruler. He became the first seeker, the one who would not die quietly. His story was no longer about power. It was about defiance. It was about a man who refused to let the gods write the final chapter of his life. The gods watched Gilgamesh with growing unease. His power stretched farther than any mortal should hold, and his questions reached too high into the sky. So they decided to send him a reminder that even kings are still human. From the clay of the earth and the breath of the wilderness, they shaped a man named Enkidu. He was not born in a palace. He was born in the open fields, raised among gazelles, drinking from rivers, running beside lions. His skin was the colour of dust, and his hair tangled with leaves. He knew no walls, no rules, no fear. Where Gilgamesh represented civilization, order, and ambition, Enkidu embodied nature, instinct, and freedom. He was the wild brother, created not to destroy Gilgamesh, but to balance him. Yet balance never comes peacefully. When the hunters of Uruk saw him roaming near their traps, they fled back to the city in terror. They told stories of a beast who freed animals, tore down fences, and defied all control. The priests called it an omen. They sent a woman named Shamhat, wise in the ways of both men and gods, to civilize the wild man. Through her, Enkidu learned language, music, and the mystery of human emotion. When he looked back at the forest, it no longer spoke to him. The animals turned away. He had crossed the invisible line that separates innocence from knowledge. Soon, word reached him of Gilgamesh, the mighty king who claimed divine right over every soul in Uruk. Enkidu felt a fire within him, a challenge awakening. He entered the city, the crowd parting, as if a storm had walked through the gate. When he met Gilgamesh for the first time, neither bowed. Two forces collided like the meeting of earth and sky. They wrestled until the ground shook, until neither could move the other, until both realized that strength recognized itself. In that moment, enemies became brothers. It was as if they had been halves of the same spirit all along. Gilgamesh found in Enkidu a reflection of the freedom he had lost to the throne. Enkidu found in Gilgamesh the purpose his wild heart had never known. Together they formed a bond that even the gods could not predict. But with their friendship came rebellion. The priests warned them to stay within the city walls, to honor the gods, to obey the laws of heaven. Yet Gilgamesh looked to the horizon, and Enkidu nodded. They decided to leave the safety of civilization to hunt for a truth hidden in forbidden lands. It was the first step on a path that would change both of them forever. In their laughter, the gods heard defiance. In their courage, they heard danger. And somewhere deep in the heavens, a whisper began to spread. The king and the wild man were no longer just men. They were a question, one the world was not yet ready to answer. The city of Uruk faded behind them, its towers shrinking into the haze of the horizon as Gilgamesh and Enkidu walked toward the unknown. The priests had warned them never to leave the safety of the walls, but the call of something ancient pulled stronger than fear. Ahead of them lay the cedar forest, a place said to breathe with the memory of the gods themselves. Every tree was alive with voices older than mankind. The wind whispered through their branches like pages turning in a living book, each leaf a record of what men had forgotten. Travellers spoke of its beauty, but also its curse. Those who entered often returned, changed, or not at all. Yet for Gilgamesh, danger was not a warning, but an invitation. He believed the forest guarded something sacred, a secret hidden by divine hands. Enkidu, who had once lived in the wild, felt the forest's power in his bones. He tried to warn his brother, saying the trees were not ordinary wood, but a library of souls, each one watching, each one remembering. Gilgamesh only smiled. Knowledge worth seeking was never meant to be safe. As they crossed the barren lands and entered the shadow of the first cedar, the air itself seemed to shift. The sunlight dimmed, replaced by a green glow filtering through the endless canopy. The ground was soft with centuries of fallen needles. Every step sank deeper into the pulse of the earth. It felt like walking inside a dream that had been dreaming long before humans existed. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Even Enkidu grew uneasy. The animals no longer sang. The breeze no longer moved. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what these two mortals would do. In the distance, a low sound rolled through the trees, neither thunder nor voice, but something between. Gilgamesh gripped his weapon and stepped forward, his heart pounding with equal parts awe and fear. He knew the forest was guarded by a being named Humbaba, chosen by the gods to protect this sacred archive. To defeat him meant more than victory. It meant trespassing into the domain of knowledge that was never meant for men. Enkidu hesitated. He remembered the old tales, how the forest was said to be a bridge between worlds, where the roots reached the underworld and the branches touched the stars. But Gilgamesh would not turn back. He looked around at the towering trunks and felt as though each one was a pillar holding up the heavens. He whispered that if the gods had built this place to keep men away, then it must hide something worth finding. Together they pressed on, each step echoing louder than the last. The shadows stretched like living things, and somewhere deep inside the forest, something began to stir. The gate of cedar had opened, and beyond it waited the first test of their forbidden journey. The air grew heavy as Gilgamesh and Enkidu stepped deeper into the cedar forest. The light above was dim, the sky swallowed by branches that tangled like veins of the earth itself. Every sound was swallowed by silence, every movement watched by unseen eyes. Then the ground began to tremble, the leaves shuddered, and from between the ancient trunks came the sound of a breath, deep and slow, like the world itself exhaling. Humbaba had awakened. To most, he was a monster, a creature of terror with the face of a storm and the voice of thunder. But to those who understood the old ways, Humbaba was something far greater. He was not a beast. He was a warden, the guardian of boundaries between mortal and divine, between curiosity and consequence. His task was not to destroy, but to protect. The knowledge hidden within this forest was not meant for men who age and die. It belonged to the gods who had once carved the laws of the world into the stars. Gilgamesh raised his eyes to the towering figure now before him. Humbaba's face flickered like firelight, his eyes glowing with an intelligence far older than Uruk. His body seemed made of bark, stone, and wind all at once. When he spoke, the sound was like many voices speaking through one mouth. He asked the king why he had come, and Gilgamesh answered simply, to seek what lies beyond the reach of time. Humbaba laughed, a sound that shook the trees. He told the king that men were not made to hold such truths, the weight of eternity would crush them. But Gilgamesh did not flinch. He said that the gods had given him life not to obey but to discover. Enkidu, standing beside him, felt the forest pulse with warning. He knew the moment they struck, Humbaba would change everything. To defeat the warden was to declare war on the limits set by heaven. Yet Gilgamesh lifted his weapon, not out of hatred but defiance. The fight that followed was not of steel and strength alone. It was a clash of will and meaning. The forest cried out as trees split and the earth cracked. The sky darkened, as if the gods were watching in disbelief. When at last Humbaba fell, his final words echoed through the air like a prophecy. He told Gilgamesh that every gate crossed comes with a cost, and that the knowledge he sought would one day demand something greater than victory. Then the forest went still, the wind ceased. The scent of cedar turned to the scent of rain. Enkidu stood trembling, realizing they had not slain a monster but silenced a guardian. Gilgamesh looked at his hands and felt no triumph, only a strange heaviness. He had won passage, but he had also broken the first rule of the divine syllabus. He had entered a classroom not meant for mortals, and though the gate was open, the lesson waiting beyond it would change the world forever. When Humbaba fell, the forest did not rejoice. It mourned. The sound that followed his last breath was not silence but sorrow, a low hum spreading through the roots and branches, like a heartbeat fading from the earth itself. The air grew cold, and the light that filtered through the trees turned pale. Gilgamesh stood over the fallen guardian, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of both triumph and dread. Enkidu knelt beside him, his hands trembling as he touched the wounded ground. They had done what no mortal dared, but even victory can cast a shadow longer than defeat. The forest was not just a place, it was a bridge between the world of men and the realm of gods. By spilling the blood of its keeper, they had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. High above, the heavens stirred. The winds shifted direction. The stars, still hidden by daylight, seemed to tremble behind the blue. Somewhere in the divine court, the gods were watching. Gilgamesh felt their gaze like fire on his skin. He had wanted knowledge, But knowledge never comes free. It demands a price, and that price was beginning to collect itself. Enkidu turned to his brother and whispered that they should leave before the wrath of the sky found them. But Gilgamesh did not move. He looked upward, raising his blood-stained hands toward the light breaking through the canopy. He did not pray. He challenged. He declared that if the gods wished to curse him for seeking the truth, then let the curse be written on the heavens themselves. That defiance echoed across worlds. The clouds darkened, thunder rolled, and for a moment the sky bled red. The two men were marked, not by wound or scar, but by fate. Their lives were now threads woven into a larger pattern, one they could not yet see. As they left the forest, the trees seemed to bow in mourning. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted their return. Enkidu could not shake the feeling that they had awakened something ancient, something that would not rest until balance was restored. He said that Humbaba's death was not an ending but an opening, and that the gods would demand repayment. Gilgamesh answered that if knowledge required a debt, then he would pay it gladly. But his voice, though strong, carried a weight of doubt. When they emerged from the shadow of the cedar forest, the sun was waiting, yet it felt colder than before. In the distance, Uruk shone like a mirage, its towers fragile under the burning sky. The people would celebrate their victory, but the heavens would not. Somewhere above the clouds, the gods sealed a decision. The king who dared to touch forbidden knowledge would learn its price, and the wild brother who stood beside him would bear its consequence. From that moment on, the sky itself became their silent witness, holding a promise written not in words, but in the language of storms. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu returned to Uruk, the people filled the streets with shouts of joy. They threw flowers from rooftops, lit torches, and sang songs praising their king who had defeated the guardian of the gods. But in the heavens, not all voices sang. One watched with eyes that burned hotter than the sun. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, saw Gilgamesh's triumph and desired him. She descended in a storm of gold and fire, her beauty radiant, her power absolute. She offered him her hand, promising him kingdoms beyond measure, immortality, and favor from the heavens. But Gilgamesh refused. He saw through her gifts, for he knew the goddess's love was a snare, and her anger was the ruin of kings. He reminded her of the lovers she had cursed before, of how each had met a cruel end once their usefulness had passed. Ishtar's smile faded, her eyes darkened. She rose back into the sky, her fury shaking the clouds. If the king would not worship her, he would suffer her wrath. The next day, the earth cracked open outside the walls of Uruk, and from its depths emerged the bull of heaven. Its breath scorched the ground. Its steps opened fissures that swallowed men whole. The people fled in terror. Crops withered beneath its shadow. It was not merely an animal, but a weapon, a divine punishment sent to remind mortals where they stood. The priests fell to their knees, begging the gods for mercy. Gilgamesh did not kneel. He looked upon the beast and saw it for what it was, the consequence of his defiance. Still, he would not surrender. With Enkidu beside him, he faced the creature head-on. The bull charged, shaking the air with a roar that split the sky. The battle raged across the plain, dust and thunder mingling as the two heroes fought for the city's life. Enkidu struck first, seizing the bull's horns, his muscles straining as he held the beast still long enough for Gilgamesh to drive his blade deep into its heart. The roar that followed echoed across heaven and earth. When the bull fell, the clouds above turned crimson. The people cheered once more, but the gods did not. In the palace, Gilgamesh wiped the blood from his sword, unaware that victory had become a curse. Enkidu laughed, and threw a piece of the bull's carcass toward the sky in mockery. It landed with a sound like thunder. That act sealed their fate. The gods could forgive the slaying of Humberbar, even the theft of sacred knowledge, but mockery of the divine was the final trespass. In that moment, a balance had been broken beyond repair. The city rejoiced, yet the heavens plotted. Above the cheers of Uruk, the stars seemed to whisper that the price for this defiance had already been written, and soon the collectors would come. The morning after the bull of heaven was slain, Uruk was filled with celebration. Music echoed through the streets, wine flowed like rivers, and people cheered for the two heroes who had saved them. But above the laughter, something unseen was moving. The gods had gathered, and their judgment was swift. They declared that one of the brothers must die for the blood they had spilled, for the insults thrown against the heavens, and they chose Enkidu. The decision was silent, but its shadow began to fall. At first, Enkidu felt only a faint sickness. His strength, once as wild as the forest, began to fade. Dreams haunted him, visions of the gods whispering his name, of rivers turning to dust. He woke trembling, sweat on his skin, fear in his eyes. Gilgamesh tried to comfort him, but his words felt hollow. For the first time, the king who had faced monsters and gods could not fight what stood before him. Death had entered his house, and no sword could drive it out. Days passed, and Enkidu weakened. The wild energy that had once made him seem half divine was gone. He cursed the gods who had made him human, cursed the gate of the cedar forest, cursed even the hunter who had led him from the wilderness. Gilgamesh held him through every fever and every cry, unable to accept that the brother given to him by the gods would now be taken by them. When the final breath left Enkidu's lips, the world grew still. The torches flickered, and the sound of the city vanished. Gilgamesh sat beside his body for 7 days and 7 nights, refusing to believe he was gone. He touched his friend's face, waiting for warmth that would never return. He covered him with fine robes, with gold and cedar oil, but nothing could hide the truth. Death had taken what no wall, no army, no king could protect. The man who had once mocked the gods now wept like a child. He saw, for the first time, that power could not buy life, that strength could not bend eternity. Enkidu had been his mirror, his equal, his other half. And now that mirror had shattered, leaving Gilgamesh alone to see what he truly was, a man afraid of the end. Grief transformed him. The proud king became a wanderer. He left his palace, his throne, and his people. He walked barefoot through deserts, through mountains, through ruins swallowed by sand. He was no longer seeking victory, he was seeking meaning. The gods had taken his brother, but they had also given him a lesson. Death was not punishment, it was the question that had no easy answer. And for Gilgamesh, that question became his new obsession. What happens after the last breath? Is there a door beyond darkness, or is everything swallowed by silence? The search for glory was over. The search for the soul had begun. The king who once ruled Uruk now walked as a shadow among strangers. Gilgamesh left behind his crown and his name, wandering through lands where no map dared to draw borders. The sun that once glinted off his palace walls now burned his skin, and the sands beneath his feet turned every step into a question. He no longer sought glory, he sought what no man had ever found, the secret that could undo death. He had buried Enkidu with his own hands, and in doing so, buried the man he used to be. Each night he stared into the stars, wondering if his brother's soul was among them or lost to the void. Somewhere in the distance, stories spoke of a man who had survived the Great Flood, the one called Utnapishtim, said to hold the knowledge of eternal life. Gilgamesh swore he would find him. But the path to eternity did not lie on any map. He followed the roads of miners and pilgrims, tunnels carved through the bones of the earth where daylight could not reach. He crossed wastelands where even birds refused to fly. He passed through cities half swallowed by sand, ruins where the wind carried whispers of forgotten empires. The further he went, the less he belonged to the world of men. His hair grew wild, his skin roughened, and his voice became a low murmur, speaking only to the silence. There were nights when he dreamed of Enkidu walking beside him again, and for a heartbeat the loneliness faded. But dawn always broke, and the emptiness returned. The travellers he met thought him mad. They offered him food, shelter, even comfort, but he refused. How could he rest when death never slept? He crossed rivers that glowed like molten glass, mountains that bled mist, and valleys where bones were the only landmarks. Every trail seemed to lead him deeper into the unknown, as if the earth itself was testing his resolve. In the caverns beneath the mountains, he met miners who spoke of passages that led to the underworld, places where time stood still and the living could hear the dead whisper. Gilgamesh descended into those tunnels, guided only by the faint echo of dripping water. The air was thick with the scent of dust and memory. Walls glimmered with strange crystals that pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of the earth. For days, he walked without seeing the sky. He lost count of time, for in that darkness, the sun and moon had no meaning. Then, deep beneath the surface, he found carvings older than the oldest temples, symbols of stars, rivers, and a spiral that seemed to swallow itself. It was then he realized that the road he sought was not a path across the land, but through the soul. He had been searching for eternity in the world around him, but the coordinates he needed were written inside the human heart. The map was not lost. It had never been drawn. The horizon glowed faintly as Gilgamesh approached the mountains where the sun was said to rise and set. The border between the world of men and the world of eternity. His body was weary, his skin torn by wind and sand, but his purpose burned brighter than the stars above. The legends called this place the House of the Scorpion Men, the gate to the path that led through the darkness beneath the mountains, where no mortal had ever walked and returned. The air was thick with silence, yet charged with unseen energy. As he climbed the last ridge, the ground trembled. From the shadows emerged figures unlike any he had seen before, towering beings whose lower halves were those of scorpions, their upper bodies shaped like men carved from obsidian. Their eyes shimmered like twin suns, and their spears gleamed with light not born from fire. Gilgamesh froze, knowing he stood before the guardians of the underworld. Each of their movements caused the air to ripple as though time itself bent around them. When they spoke, their voices sounded like stone grinding against stone. They asked why a mortal dared to cross into the path of the gods. Gilgamesh bowed his head and answered with the truth. He said he sought Utnapishtim, the one who had conquered death, for he could not bear to live knowing his brother had vanished into silence. The guardians looked at one another, their expressions unreadable. They could see that his spirit was cracked by grief, but forged by determination. One of them lifted his spear, its tip glowing like a star being born. He told Gilgamesh that the path ahead was the road of night, the tunnel where the sun passes beneath the earth. No mortal light could survive there, and only those chosen by the gods could walk it. Gilgamesh stepped forward, saying that he would take no light but his own. For a long moment, the scorpion men said nothing. Then one nodded. He placed his spear on the ground, and where it touched, the rock split open, revealing a passage of endless shadow. The guardian warned that within those depths, the boundaries of time and thought would collapse, and that if he faltered, his mind would be lost forever. Gilgamesh thanked them and crossed the threshold. The air grew cold, and the sound of the world faded until even his heartbeat seemed far away. Behind him, the gate sealed shut, leaving him alone in the corridor of eternal night. Each step forward was swallowed by darkness so deep it felt alive. He could no longer tell if he was walking on stone or on the edge of dreams. Yet in that silence, faint glimmers of light appeared, not from fire, but from symbols carved into the walls, glowing softly with knowledge written in the language of stars. He realized he was inside the Library of the Night, a place where the heavens recorded what the earth had forgotten, and somewhere within that infinite tunnel, the answer to mortality waited. Gilgamesh emerged from the tunnel of darkness, pale and hollow-eyed, the sun burning his skin as if he had been reborn. The mountains behind him sealed their mouths, and the sky ahead opened wide, stretching over an endless plain where the air shimmered with heat. His journey had taken him beyond the map of the living, and every step forward felt like walking through time itself. Days blurred into nights, and nights into the silence between stars. When he finally saw smoke rising in the distance, he followed it, hoping it led to something human. What he found was a small tavern, standing alone at the edge of the sea, a place where the waves broke softly, as though whispering secrets from beyond the horizon. A woman waited there, her eyes calm and ancient, her hand steady as she poured drink into a clay cup. She was Siduri, the tavern keeper at the edge of time. She looked at him as though she had been expecting him. Without asking his name, she told him to sit. Her voice was neither kind nor harsh, but full of understanding. She said she knew his story, the king who could not accept death, the hero who challenged gods. She poured him wine and told him to drink, to rest, to live. She said the gods had given mortals a gift greater than immortality, the gift of moments that end, so they might be cherished. Eat your bread with joy, she said. Love your wife, dance, build, and be content. That is the true way to defeat death. Gilgamesh listened, but his heart resisted. He told her that comfort was a lie, and that peace was a cage. He had not come this far to forget what he had lost. Siduri studied him, seeing the desperation behind his eyes. She said those who chase eternity often lose the present, and that even the gods envied humans for their fleeting beauty. But Gilgamesh shook his head. He said that if the gods envied mortals, it was only because mortals had not yet seen what was possible. He refused to rest. He refused to drink. He said he would not be soothed by temporary pleasures while his brother lay in eternal silence. Siduri sighed, knowing words could not turn him from his path. She told him of Ur-Shanabi, the ferryman who served Utnapishtim across the waters of death, the one place no living man could reach. She said that if Gilgamesh still wished to find what he sought, he must cross that sea, but the price would be more than he could imagine. Gilgamesh thanked her and turned toward the horizon, his shadow stretching long behind him. Siduri watched him go, whispering that the truth he sought was not hidden by the gods, but buried within his own heart. As he disappeared into the wind, she lifted her cup to the fading light and said softly that some lessons must be lived, not learned. And the sea waited, endless and still, reflecting the face of a man who could not forget. The wind off the sea tasted of metal and ash as Gilgamesh stood at its edge, staring into a horizon where the sky met the underworld. The waves moved like breathing, slow and deliberate, as though the ocean itself was alive. Somewhere beyond that line waited Utnapishtim, the man who had survived the great flood, the one who knew the secret of eternity, but no mortal could cross those waters without help. Gilgamesh searched the shore until he found a small dock built of blackened wood, and beside it a boat carved from a single trunk of ancient cedar. Its oars were marked with strange symbols that pulsed faintly under the sun. A tall man stood beside it, his skin weathered by centuries of salt and silence. This was Urshanabi, the ferryman of the dead, the keeper of the channel between life and forever. He looked at Gilgamesh without surprise, as if every traveller who sought immortality eventually came to him. When Gilgamesh asked for passage, Urshanabi said nothing for a long while. Then he spoke, his voice like the grinding of old ropes. "The boat can carry no illusions," he said. "To cross, you must leave behind everything that belongs to time." Gilgamesh frowned, not understanding. Urshanabi pointed to the tools Gilgamesh carried, the bow, the sword, the emblems of his kingship. "Break them," he said. "The river allows no weight of the past." For a moment Gilgamesh hesitated. Those weapons had conquered empires. They were proof of who he was. But as he looked into the dark water, he saw his reflection twist and dissolve. He knew then that to reach eternity, he would have to destroy everything that had defined him. One by one, he shattered the relics of his life, until only silence remained. Urshanabi nodded and told him to gather wood for poles, for the waters of death could not be touched by hand or oar. Gilgamesh worked until his palms split, fashioning hundreds of poles from driftwood, each to be used once and discarded. When all was ready, Urshanabi gestured for him to board. The boat creaked as it lifted from the shore. Gilgamesh began to push them forward, each pole sinking into black water that hissed and steamed. With every stroke, the sea seemed to whisper memories of those who had failed before him. Hours turned into days, and his hands blistered until blood stained the wood. Urshanabi watched in silence. For every wound was a toll, every drop of pain a price for passage. Finally, when the last pole was gone, they drifted in still water that reflected nothing at all. Gilgamesh looked around and saw only endless dark. He had crossed the line where time ends and truth begins. Urshanabi told him he had paid the ferryman's due, but the real cost was yet to come. Ahead, through the mist, the shape of a distant shore began to form. It was the land where no man grows old, and where every question finds its final echo. The shore appeared first as a shimmer, then as land, quiet and still beneath a sky that looked too calm to be real. Gilgamesh stepped off the boat, his legs trembling after the long crossing. The air was heavy, almost sacred, and the ground felt older than the world he had left behind. At the edge of a vast garden, a man waited. His eyes were clear but tired, carrying the weight of centuries. This was Utnapishtim, the one the gods had spared when they drowned the world. He was neither god nor man anymore, but something in between, a keeper of forbidden memory. Gilgamesh bowed deeply and said he had come to learn the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim studied him for a long while, then turned toward the sea. His voice when it came was soft, as if he were speaking not to Gilgamesh, but to time itself. He said the flood had not been a punishment, but a reset. The world had grown too proud, and the gods feared what men were learning, not spells or weapons, but knowledge, the kind that dissolves fear. People had begun to read the patterns of the stars, to harness the breath of storms, to heal with roots and resonance. The gods, who once ruled through mystery, saw their control slipping away. So they whispered to each other, and a decision was made. They would cleanse the earth, erase the evidence, and begin again. Utnapishtim was chosen to survive, not because of piety, but because he understood the laws of the deep. He built the ark not only from wood, but from memory, carrying fragments of language, science, and the geometry of life itself. When the waters rose and the mountains vanished beneath waves, it was knowledge that kept the ark afloat, not divine favor. When the flood receded, he said, "The gods repented, but only in silence." They gave him immortality as a symbol, a monument to their guilt, and a warning to others. The secret he guarded was not a formula for endless life, but the truth that knowledge is the real seed of divinity. That is why it was hidden, why every empire since has been built upon fragments and not the whole. Gilgamesh listened in awe, his heart pounding. He asked if he too could learn that knowledge. Utnapishtim smiled sadly. He said, "Knowledge cannot be given. It can only be remembered. Humanity once knew it, and one day it will again. But those who seek it too soon are always silenced, their discoveries buried, their cities burned. The gods no longer need to send floods. Ignorance is the new water, and it drowns the mind without leaving a mark." Gilgamesh stood in silence as the waves lapped at his feet. He had crossed the sea of death only to find that immortality was not the absence of dying, but the endurance of truth, and those who guard that truth, like Utnapishtim, live forever in the space between memory and myth. Utnapishtim listened to Gilgamesh's desperate plea for the secret of eternal life, and for a long time said nothing. The wind moved softly through the reeds, as though even nature was holding its breath. Then Utnapishtim turned to him and said that the gods had already granted him what he sought, not through immortality of body, but through awareness, the kind that sees beyond the illusion of endings. Yet if Gilgamesh truly wished to know if he was ready to hold that gift, he must pass a test that no king before him had endured. He must remain awake for 7 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh frowned, confused. Wakefulness seemed simple compared to the monsters and storms he had conquered. Utnapishtim warned that it was no ordinary challenge, for sleeplessness was not about strength, but about surrender. The mind of a mortal cannot face eternity without breaking. Still, Gilgamesh agreed, believing his will would not fail him. Utnapishtim led him to a quiet chamber by the shore, a place where the sea hummed softly like an ancient heartbeat. He told him to sit, to close his eyes, but not sleep, and left him alone. At first, Gilgamesh felt strong. His thoughts burned like fire, his eyes sharp, his spirit defiant. He counted the hours by the sound of the waves, and thought of Enkidu, of Uruk, of all he had lost. But as the night deepened, his thoughts began to twist. Shapes moved in the corners of his mind. The stars seemed to breathe. He tried to resist, but his eyelids grew heavy. He told himself kings do not sleep, but his body betrayed him. His head fell forward, and the darkness welcomed him. When he awoke, Utnapishtim was standing before him, smiling with a sadness only eternity could teach. 6 loaves of bread sat beside him, 1 baked for each day he had slept. Time had passed without his knowing. Gilgamesh looked at the bread, stale and cracked, proof of his failure. He tried to speak, but no words came. Utnapishtim told him gently that no man could remain awake in the face of forever. The body must rest, the mind must forget. Mortality is not a curse, he said. It is the rhythm that keeps the soul from unraveling. The gods did not deny humans immortality out of cruelty, but mercy. To live without sleep, without endings, is to lose the meaning of beginnings. Gilgamesh felt shame rise within him, but also something else, understanding. He realized that the quest for eternal life was not about escaping death, but about learning to live with it. Immortality was not a potion, it was a posture of mind, one that no king could be handed. It had to be earned through awakening, not conquering. As the sea sighed beyond the door, Gilgamesh bowed his head, feeling for the first time that wisdom and weariness were the same gift. The test of sleeplessness had ended in failure, yet Utnapishtim was not cruel. He saw that Gilgamesh's hunger for truth was not greed, but grief, the ache of a man who loved too deeply to let go. So he decided to give him one last chance. He led him to the edge of the sea, where the water turned darker than night and the air shimmered with quiet power. Beneath those depths, he said, lay a plant unlike any other, one that could bend the flow of time. It was called the Thorn of Renewal, born when the first light of the world touched the ocean floor. It did not grant immortality, but it restored what had been lost: youth, strength, memory. For those who protected it, life could begin again. But reaching it would not be easy. Utnapishtim told him that the plant grew in a place no air could reach, and only those who faced death without fear could touch it. Gilgamesh stripped himself of his armor and dove into the black water. The cold was like knives, slicing through his skin and bones. The deeper he went, the heavier his body became, until his lungs screamed for air. But then he saw it, a faint glow rising from the seabed, pulsing softly like the heartbeat of the earth. The plant looked simple, a small bloom surrounded by thorns of gold, its petals shifting color like dawn breaking across the sky. He reached for it carefully, feeling its stem resist him, as if it knew what it was. Then, with one final pull, he freed it. The water around him shimmered, and for a brief moment he felt time pause. His lungs filled with light, not air, and he rose back to the surface. Utnapishtim stood waiting, his eyes reflecting both sorrow and hope. Gilgamesh held the plant high, laughing with relief. He said he would take it back to Uruk, to share it with his people, to let the old become young again. For the first time since Enkidu's death, he smiled. Utnapishtim nodded, but warned him that what is not guarded by wisdom will always return to the sea. The gift was not meant to be owned, but understood. Gilgamesh promised he would protect it. He placed the plant close to his heart as he began the long journey home. Along the way, he dreamed of cities reborn, of children laughing, of towers rising higher than the stars. For a while, he believed that perhaps the gods had forgiven mankind. The road back to Uruk seemed lighter, the wind softer, the world brighter. Yet beneath that light, the ocean whispered, as if it remembered something he did not. Every gift carries its shadow, and every secret tests the hand that holds it. Gilgamesh had found the flower that could bend time, but time was not done bending him. The desert stretched endlessly as Gilgamesh journeyed home, the precious plant wrapped carefully in woven cloth, its glow faint but alive beneath the layers. Each night, he rested beside rivers and under stars, dreaming of Uruk reborn, of elders walking with the strength of youth, of life made whole again. The Thorn of Renewal was his redemption, the proof that the gods could be defied, that death was not final but negotiable. Yet fate has a way of correcting what it calls imbalance. On the 7th day of his journey, Gilgamesh came upon a spring at the edge of a canyon. The water shimmered, cool and clear, and for the first time since leaving Utnapishtim's land, he allowed himself to rest completely. He removed his armor, laid down the plant beside him, and stepped into the pool. The water wrapped around him like silk, washing away the dust of his travels. For a brief moment, he forgot his grief, his fear, his endless search. The world was still. Then the silence broke. From the edge of the rocks, a serpent slithered forward, drawn by the scent of the plant's power. Its scales gleamed with colours that shifted like oil in sunlight, each movement soundless and deliberate. Gilgamesh turned just in time to see it sink its fangs into the cloth, swallowing the flower whole before vanishing into the sand. He lunged, but the water slowed him, and within seconds the creature was gone. Only the shimmer of its trail remained, glowing faintly before fading into nothing. The king stood motionless, disbelief turning to despair. The plant, His proof of victory over death had been taken. He fell to his knees beside the pool and stared into the water, seeing his reflection ripple into fragments. The serpent would shed its skin and be renewed forever. The gift meant for mankind had returned to the creatures of the earth. In that moment, he understood. Immortality was not denied to man. It simply belonged to those who lived without clinging to it. The snake needed no crown, no temple, no story. It simply existed, and in that existence, it was reborn endlessly. But for man, the need to preserve became the prison. When Gilgamesh finally returned to Uruk, empty-handed, he carried only memory. The priests listened to his story and smiled politely, recording what they could and revising what they wished. They called the serpent's theft divine will, a punishment for pride. They said the flower was never meant for human hands. They turned his failure into a lesson, his grief into a parable, his truth into myth. History, they said, must be edited to protect the faithful. And so the real story, the one written in salt and tears, was locked away. Gilgamesh built walls that reached for the heavens, hoping stone would preserve what the priests would not. Yet deep beneath those walls, in the soil of Uruk, the memory of the serpent still coils, waiting for the day when the truth will shed its skin once more. When Gilgamesh returned to Uruk, the city seemed smaller than he remembered. The walls he had once built to scrape the edge of heaven now felt like monuments to a dream he no longer believed in. The people gathered to see their king, expecting treasures, relics, and stories of immortality. But Gilgamesh came home with only silence. The plant that could bend time was gone, swallowed by a serpent, its promise now lost to the sands. Yet in that loss, something inside him had changed. For the first time, he no longer sought to conquer death. He sought to understand it. He walked through the streets he had once ruled with pride, watching children play in the dust, merchants shouting at the markets, and the old sitting quietly in the shade. Life went on, unbothered by the grand questions that had haunted him. He realized that this, not eternity, was what the gods had meant to protect. The rhythm of living, the beauty of endings, the strength to begin again. Standing before the massive gates of Uruk, he looked up at the stones. Each block had been cut and carried by human hands, carved with sweat and song, set in place by those whose names were already forgotten, and yet their work endured. A thought took root in him. If he could not outrun time, perhaps he could outlast it through memory. He gathered his scribes, artisans, and builders, and ordered that the story of his journey be inscribed into the walls themselves, not as a boast, but as a record. He wanted the truth carved so deeply that even if kings and priests tried to edit it, the stone would resist. For years, they worked, chiseling tablets and shaping reliefs that told of the wild man, Enkidu, the cedar forest, the flood, the plant, the serpent, and the lesson he had learned. Gilgamesh no longer wore his crown with pride, but with humility. He told his people that no man should seek to be a god, for even gods fear the forgetting. It is not immortality that defines greatness, but remembrance, and remembrance begins with honesty. When the work was done, he climbed to the top of Uruk's wall at dusk. The city below glowed like amber in the fading light. He looked out over the desert where his journey had begun, and whispered that he finally understood. The gods had not denied him immortality, they had taught him to create it. For every brick, every story, every act of kindness would ripple beyond his lifetime. The walls would crumble one day, but not the words carved within them. They would speak for him long after his body returned to dust. Gilgamesh smiled, feeling at peace for the first time. He had returned not to conquer death, but to become part of life itself, engraved into the memory of the world. The story of Gilgamesh spread quickly across the land, carried by merchants, travelers, and wandering poets. Each retelling added a new color, a new breath. Some said he had defied the gods, others said he had spoken with them. His journey through the mountains, the flood, and the underworld became a legend that shimmered like gold in the firelight. But legends are dangerous when they begin to sound too much like truth. And truth, in the hands of men who wish to control it, becomes something else entirely. The temple scribes of Uruk were the first to collect his tale into clay tablets, pressed with reeds and baked in the sun. They worked in silence, line after line, capturing every detail of his story. Yet not all of them were writing the same thing. Within the cool chambers of the temple, behind heavy stone doors, sat two kinds of scribes. One wrote with devotion, recording the epic as it was told, every moment of doubt, every cry of grief, every glimpse of forbidden knowledge. The other wrote with caution, erasing what could challenge faith. One pen shaped memory, the other shaped obedience. Together, they forged the version of history that would survive. When Gilgamesh spoke of Utnapishtim's wisdom and the god's fear of human understanding, the red pen softened it. The gods were not afraid, it said, they were merciful. When he described the plant that could bend time, the red pen renamed it, calling it a test rather than a truth. When he confessed that immortality was not to be taken but lived through legacy, they shortened his words, reducing revelation to parable. The first version of the poem was full of wonder. The final version was full of warning. The scribes sealed the originals in clay jars and placed them deep in the archives beneath the temple. There, the real story slept in darkness, untouched, while the edited one was read to the public, sung in ceremonies, and taught to generations. It became a holy story, safe, predictable, and easily controlled. The priests smiled, proud of their work. The gods had been made perfect again, and mankind was reminded to stay small. Yet some scribes wept quietly as they sealed the jars. They knew that one day someone might dig them up and wonder why the gods had ever feared a man's search for truth. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, and languages changed, but the two versions remained buried beneath the same city. One was the poem the world was allowed to know. The other was the echo beneath it, the heartbeat of the original fire. The scribes had written with two pens, one to preserve, the other to erase. And in doing so, they taught the world a lesson that would repeat for ages to come. The first story is always human. The second is always edited. And the space between them is where truth hides, waiting for someone brave enough to read both. In the quiet hours of night, when temple fires burned low and the priests had gone to sleep, a different story moved through the corridors of Uruk. It was whispered by old scribes who had seen too much ink and too many edits. They spoke of teachers older than the temples, older than kings, older even than the gods men now worshipped. They called them the Apkallu, the fish-cloaked sages who rose from the deep when the world was still young. It was said they walked between land and water, carrying in their hands tablets of light. From those tablets came the first words, the first numbers, the first maps of the stars. They taught humanity how to build, how to measure, how to remember. They were not worshipped, but welcomed, and the people learned eagerly from them. Yet, as generations passed, the teachings of the Apkallu began to challenge those who ruled. Knowledge gave people power, and power threatened the priests who mediated between men and gods. The Apkallu spoke of balance, of creation as a shared act, of heaven and earth as mirrors of one another. But the temples wanted hierarchy, obedience, and mystery. So the Apkallu became a problem. The priests rewrote the stories, changing the teachers into myths. The fish-cloaked sages were turned into spirits, half divine, half monstrous. Their appearance was said to mark the flood, their wisdom rebranded as dangerous magic. Where they had once been called the bringers of civilization, they were now blamed for the corruption of men. Statues of them still stood in the temple corners, small and covered in dust, carved with scales and wings, their eyes forever fixed on eternity. The priests told the people they were guardians, not guides. But the old scribes knew better. They said that each Apkallu had left behind a fragment of their knowledge buried beneath the rivers, hidden within patterns of stars and sequences of numbers that only the patient could decode. Some claimed the flood Utnapishtim survived was not sent by the gods, but by the Apkallu themselves, to wash away the misuse of what they had given. After the flood, only traces of their language remained, carved in cuneiform, stored in jars, or hidden in chants disguised as prayers. Gilgamesh, during his search for eternal life, had seen their symbols without knowing it. The spirals, the seven-pointed stars, the fish motif repeating in the carvings of the underworld. The knowledge was there, waiting, but forbidden to be spoken aloud. The priests feared that if people remembered the first teachers, they would stop bowing and start building again. So they erased the names, blurred the faces, and left the Apkallu drifting between myth and memory. Yet their presence never fully vanished. Every time a scribe dipped his pen, every time a stargazer traced constellations, the shadow of the Apkallu returned. Their greatest secret was never lost. It was simply recast as imagination, for nothing hides better than truth disguised as myth. Centuries passed, and the clay tablets of Gilgamesh slept beneath layers of sand and silence. Empires rose where Uruk once stood, each claiming to be the true heir of the Golden Age. Yet as kings built new cities on the ruins of the old, they discovered something inconvenient. The timelines did not align. Records from older dynasties spoke of events that could not fit into the calendars of the new. Reigns overlapped where they should not. Floods, wars, and celestial signs appeared twice, sometimes centuries apart. The scribes of each empire faced a choice. To admit the gaps would unravel their history, or to close them would preserve their power. They chose the latter. The tablets were rewritten. The years were moved like boundary stones, shifted to fit a smoother story. Gilgamesh, once a flesh and blood king, became a figure who could be placed anywhere, moulded to support whichever ruler needed divine legitimacy. Some said he lived 2,000 years before the flood. Others said only 500. Some called him the son of a goddess, others a mortal granted wisdom by the gods. The dates became elastic, bending to the will of those who controlled the calendar. In Babylon, scribes aligned his reign with the stars to legitimize their zodiac. In Assyria, they made him a prophet of conquest. In Persia, he was turned into a symbol of sacred kingship. Every empire found in him what it needed most, a bridge to divine ancestry and the right to rule. The manipulation of time became an art form. When kings redated Gilgamesh, they redated the gods themselves, adjusting the entire rhythm of history. The flood was said to have occurred not once but many times, each version resetting the human story. And each time, the priests claimed it was divine order, not political design. The calendar became a throne, invisible yet absolute. Those who set it ruled not just the present, but the memory of the past. Deep within temple archives, the oldest tablets were sealed away. Their inscriptions too dangerous, because they told of different days, different rulers, different truths. The newer copies were presented as originals, their dates carefully synchronized to the empire's official timeline. Time itself had been edited, and no one outside the temples would ever know. The manipulation was so seamless that later generations could no longer tell which history was real. To them, Gilgamesh had always lived when the priests said he did. His legend, now fixed in their calendar, became the unshakable foundation for all who followed. Kings would bow to his image while rewriting his era, never realizing that in trying to inherit his glory, they had buried his truth. The gods did not move the stars, the scribes did. And in that silent rearrangement of time, they discovered the most powerful secret of all, that whoever commands the calendar commands eternity. In the city of Nineveh, where the Tigris glimmered like liquid silver under the sun, Ashurbanipal commanded a library unlike any the world had seen. Clay tablets filled the halls from floor to ceiling, each pressed with symbols that captured the cosmos itself. The knowledge of centuries, of empires, of kings, and of the stars was stored here. Gilgamesh's story rested among them, alongside the secrets of the Apkallu, the maps of floods, and the first patterns of mathematics. It was a universe compressed into clay. Rumors of the collection spread like wildfire. Enemies, fearing the power of such knowledge, sent armies and fire. Cities burned across Mesopotamia, and yet the tablets endured. The fire that consumed homes and markets could not touch them. The clay baked, hardened, and survived. Every attempt to erase the lessons of the past only made them stronger, preserving the wisdom in ways the scribes had not anticipated. Scholars marveled at the resilience, whispering that the gods themselves had protected this library. Ashurbanipal moved among the shelves, his hands brushing over the inscriptions. He read the histories of kings long forgotten, the instructions of sages who had walked between water and sky, the poems that spoke of love, loss, and the search for immortality. He understood that knowledge was more than power. It was survival. And yet, he knew that the fires of war, of conquest, and of fear were constant. Every generation that discovered a new tablet risked seeing it disappear in smoke. The lessons of the past were dangerous, precisely because they reminded men that they could shape their own destinies. In one hall, the tablets told of the flood, of Utnapishtim, and the plant that could bend time. Gilgamesh's words glimmered faintly in the firelight, a record of his triumphs and failures, his grief and his understanding. The scribes who copied his tale had tried to soften it, but the clay could not be rewritten as easily as ink. The message survived. Even when the Assyrian army faced rebellion, even when cities fell into dust, the tablets remained, their baked surfaces resisting flame and sword alike. And so it became clear that erasure could not succeed. Knowledge, once committed to clay, to memory, to human hands, carried its own immortality. Ashurbanipal realized that to hoard it was one thing, but to preserve it against ignorance and destruction was another. Every tablet saved was a thread holding civilization together, a way to remember the truths that others sought to bury. In that library, Gilgamesh's story, the lessons of the Apkallu, and the fragments of forgotten kings became more than tales. They became proof that memory could not be destroyed, that wisdom persisted even when men believed they had conquered it. The clay universe would endure because those who feared it most had inadvertently made it eternal. And in the silence of the halls, amidst the smell of baked clay and ink, the echoes of 1,000 stories waited for the next hands brave enough to read them. After the fires cooled and the kingdoms fell, the tablets lay untouched. From Babylon to Byzantium, from golden ziggurats to candle-lit cathedrals, the story of Gilgamesh and the clay-bound wisdom of his age faded into shadows, not because it was forgotten, but because it was quietly placed out of reach. Cuneiform, once the language of kings and sky readers, became a puzzle no one bothered to solve. The signs were still there, carved in stone and pressed into clay, but no one asked what they meant. It was easier to call them decoration, to pretend they were ornaments instead of echoes. In the great shift from temple to church, from open sky to vaulted ceilings, the custodians of knowledge became gatekeepers. Monks in stone rooms took over where priests left off, copying texts by hand, deciding which stories would survive the leap across centuries. They kept their lamps low and their shelves quiet. What could not be translated into Latin or wrapped in scripture was placed in cellars behind locks under dust. The memory of Gilgamesh, the flood, the plant, the serpents, the Apkallu, all of it was labelled myth and sealed away. Silence was rebranded as piety. To question timelines or dig too deeply into forgotten empires was seen as rebellion against divine order. Better to let memory sleep than risk waking questions that had no easy answers. The priests had once feared knowledge for its challenge to their authority. Now the curators feared it for the way it complicated salvation. In the scrolls of Byzantium, Gilgamesh did not appear. In the vaults of early Christendom, his name was not spoken. He became a ghost in the margins, a footnote to stories that preferred cleaner heroes. As cities turned to ruins and alphabets changed, the clay tablets waited. They did not rust. They did not fade. They did not beg to be remembered. They endured. The long silence stretched across centuries like a veil. Scholars believed history began with the Greeks. The flood, if mentioned at all, was attributed only to Noah. The sages who once walked from sea to city were cast as demons or dismissed as dreams. But silence is not the same as absence. In private rooms and dusty corners, a few curious minds still noticed the patterns. They saw the symbols on ancient walls. They copied fragments of old signs onto scraps of parchment, wondering what they meant. These fragments passed hand to hand, sometimes burned, sometimes buried, but never fully gone. The long intermission was not death. It was a pause, a waiting. While empires renamed the truth and buried it under doctrine, the tablets kept their rhythm. They did not shout. They did not fight. They simply remained. And deep in the dark, behind monastery doors and beneath cathedral floors, memory waited, not for permission, but for rediscovery. The world had filed it away under private, but the seal would not hold forever. The silence broke in the 19th century, not with trumpets or thunder, but with the scrape of a spade in the dust of ancient Nineveh. Beneath layers of sand and centuries of forgetting, the ground opened its mouth and began to speak. British archaeologists digging through the ruins of what had once been Ashurbanipal's library unearthed tablet after tablet, each covered in strange wedge-shaped marks no one could yet read. At first, they thought it was just more decoration, relics of a lost civilization that had left behind impressive statues but no voice. But the tablets kept coming, hundreds of them, then thousands. Clay books from a forgotten library, some cracked, some whole, all covered in the same mysterious script. They were packed and shipped back to London, placed in boxes, stored in drawers, studied by candlelight by men who had no idea what they were holding. It was not until a young translator named George Smith began working on one particular tablet that the spell truly shattered. The moment came quietly, with Smith bent over a clay fragment in the British Museum in the year 1872. As he read, the air seemed to tighten around him. There, on the surface of that ancient tablet, were lines that mirrored a story he already knew. A great flood sent by angry gods, a man warned in advance, a boat, a dove sent out to find land. Smith dropped the tablet. His hands shook. He had just discovered that the Book of Genesis had an older sibling, and its name was Gilgamesh. The flood story etched into that clay was part of a much larger epic, one that scholars would slowly begin to piece together from scattered fragments found across Mesopotamia. It was the oldest story ever written, older than Moses, older than Homer, a tale of kings and gods, grief and wisdom, death and the desperate search to defeat it. Gilgamesh, once buried under layers of silence and edits, now stared back at the modern world with ancient eyes. His voice returned, not as myth, but as memory. The academic world reeled. The discovery forced scholars to rethink the foundations of Western history. It raised questions no one was prepared to answer. Had the flood story travelled from Babylon to the Bible? Had fragments of forgotten civilizations shaped the roots of modern belief? The canon, once thought complete, now revealed it had drafts, earlier ones, and they did not follow the rules. Gilgamesh was raw, philosophical, unresolved. He failed his tests. He cried. He lost. And somehow, that made him more real than the perfect heroes of later scriptures. The dig had unearthed more than clay. It had unearthed a crack in the story of time. And once that crack opened, the light came pouring in. The tablets had waited for almost 3,000 years, but they had not grown quiet. They had only grown stronger. And now the world was listening again. Gilgamesh did not find the potion. He did not conquer death. He did not carry the flower home. What he carried instead was something far more dangerous. He brought back a blueprint, not one sketched on papyrus or carved in gold, but embedded in his story itself, a code hidden in the rhythm of his journey, a quiet instruction for those who came after: build, write, remember. Resist redaction. When he returned to Uruk and looked upon its walls, he understood. These stones would crumble, the rivers would shift, the temples would fall. But stories carved deep enough would outlive every empire. He had failed to live forever, but in telling the truth, in not sanitizing his struggle, he had done something greater. He had made space for memory to survive flame. His pain became a signal, his failure a warning, his curiosity a door left ajar. And when the priests tried to edit him, the clay did not flinch. The tablets outlived the priests, the myth escaped its editors, and the blueprint made its way to us. What Gilgamesh smuggled through time was not the secret to immortality, but the instructions for guarding it. He showed that knowledge would always be labelled forbidden by those who benefit from forgetting, that the deepest truths will always be buried beneath myths designed to pacify, to entertain, to control, but also that the truth cannot be erased, only delayed. Now, we are the ones holding the archive. The clay is no longer pressed by reeds, but typed into servers and whispered across networks. But the duty is the same: to protect the fragile truths from the fires of redaction, to ask questions even when they are inconvenient, to remember the stories that were nearly lost. Every generation is offered the plant. Some pick it and forget to guard it. Others pass it along in silence, hoping it will be planted where it can grow. We are no longer seeking the secret. We are living inside it. Every time we read a story not taught in school, every time we question the clean version, every time we recover what was buried, we keep Gilgamesh alive. Not as a hero who conquered the gods, but as a man who dared to face them and return with his memory intact. His immortality is not in the flesh. It is in the echo, in the archive. And now we are the guardians of that archive. The question is not whether the knowledge will survive. It already has. The question is whether we will be brave enough to hold it, to carry it forward, to keep the blueprint alive in a world still trying to forget. Gilgamesh reached the edge of the map and came back. The rest is up to us.